These conversations made me really think hard. First of all, a new question arose: where were we going, and what kind of work would we have to do? After the departure of my Zamostoyev pals and Vladishevsky, I was left alone. Gorchakov did not count, because he spent a lot of time on administrative work in our Russian sector, and when he was free he usually went to the general's barracks. Few people had free access to it, but he did. Having learned from the bitter experience of the past winter, I did not trust the new people around me. The only person with whom I thought I could share my doubts and thoughts was Bedritsky. I told him what I had learned about Peenemünde and asked his opinion. At the beginning of July, our group was transferred to a completely different part of the camp, to a huge, gloomy old barracks with 3-story iron bunks, big long tables in the middle, furnished with chairs. The barracks was designed for 100 men, and there were only 28 of us. A day later, the replenishment arrived: 2 engineer captains, Evgeny Prisadsky and Vasily Bodunov, both from the Penza bicycle factory, Major Peter Piskarov, and a young Lieutenant Anatoly Shurupov. Piskarov was appointed foreman of the team, and Shurupov official interpreter. I became completely sick, weakened, and my legs were swelling more and more. Here in Hammelburg I was much more hungry than in the worst times in Zamosk. There the food was so disgusting that in spite of hunger one had to force oneself sometimes to take it into one's mouth and swallow it. Here in Hammelburg, on the contrary, everything was of decent quality and taste: bread, potatoes, soup, and what was given over and above these 3 basic whales of our diet. But the quantities given were so minuscule that in fact we ate for 5 or 10 minutes during the whole day, and the rest of the time, 23. And 3/4 of an hour we were painfully hungry. I began to sleep badly, getting up at night, drinking water without end. My stomach only worked once a week. Our barracks was on the very edge of the Russian sector. Why this brick structure, probably 100 years old, was included in the perimeter of the sector, God knows. To get to the camp, from our barracks we had to walk along a path along a wire fence, and behind the fence there were 2 barracks where German soldiers lived. One morning, weaving along this path, I saw a German soldier throw 2 loaves of bread over the fence, picked up on the fly by some lucky prisoners. The thought of the possibility of getting a piece of bread in this way seized my whole being, and I spent the whole day on the path waiting for the smile of fate. Alas, nothing came. Then I decided to get up early in the morning and try my luck once more. It was still half dark when I took a position at the fence against the German barracks. Soon a blonde-haired, dense soldier, without uniform and wearing flip-flops on his bare feet, came out of one barrack. He went to the restroom, reappeared and, scratching himself, looked at the sky, then, glancing at my figure, went to his barrack. Another appeared, made the same journey, stood at the edge of the road and lit a cigarette. I ventured to act: bitte, Herr Soldat. Brot. Ein kleines Stück, bitte, Herr Soldat. It was as if we were really forgotten, and I began to think that even if we were finally sent to work, I might be rejected for health reasons. On Bedritsky's advice, I made an appointment with a doctor in the sanitary unit. I was received by a very nice young doctor from Kharkov. Having carefully examined me, he said, "Your body is healthy and strong, but you are hungry to the extreme. I will give you some pills and give you an injection. After that, the orderly will give you liquid porridge, very nutritious. Come every day in the morning for this treatment, including the porridge. It should help." It helped. After a few days I began to feel much stronger. Even the swelling in my legs began to subside noticeably. I behaved in a way that did not please anyone. We are, unfortunately, slaves. Knowing your stroppy nature, I warn you of this. Don't risk your life, you and we will need it. What I said about the beginning of the organization of the Liberation Army is beginning to take definite shape. I hope to meet you again. Now, about something else. Major Piskarov has been appointed by the camp management as your group's foreman, and I don't know why. I don't know who he is or what he breathes, but what I know about him doesn't make me sympathize with him. How Piskarov, a Soviet major, came to trust the Germans so much, I don't know either. They say he is very pro-German. I somehow instinctively do not believe him and advise you to be wary of him, at least until you can figure him out for yourself. If we succeed in organizing the Liberation Army, we shall have to show some pro-Germanness for a while, but this will be only at the top, in official relations. It is possible that Piskarov has this camouflage too, for personal reasons. You will see for yourself. That is, in fact, all I wanted to say. Be healthy and careful. In the morning, after the same abundant breakfast, a field officer appeared. We were given marching rations, put into a truck and brought to the railroad station Hammelburg. We, 32 men, were comfortably accommodated in a teplushka with bunks, a parasha under a tarpaulin hood providing privacy, and a tank with drinking water. 2 German soldiers sat down at the open doors. Our car was hitched to a passenger train, and we drove off. We travelled, as they call it, in the first class. We had a march ration, a whole loaf of bread, a can of tinned vegetables with small pieces of meat, a pack of cigarettes for 2, plus our escorts twice a day brought a pretty decent soup, which we could eat from scratch. Our road escort consisted of a field febel and 6 soldiers, who changed every 4 to 5 hours at the open doors of the wagon. The rest of us went somewhere in the train. All the soldiers and the field officer were elderly, good-natured and quite talkative people. They all talked about Germany, about the towns the train was passing by, showed pictures of their wives, children, and one of their grandchildren, treated us to cigarettes, and everyone was happy. Through Shurapov we asked them questions about where we were going, what kind of work we were doing, and what the ANR was. The soldiers either didn't know much about the ANR themselves, or for some reason they didn't want to talk about it. I immediately remembered my conversation with Wladishevsky, because one of the soldiers, raising his finger, also began with a mysterious, "Oh! Oh!" Such a wichtig organization, and another confirmed his comrade's words by shaking his head affirmatively, and with a significant look also said, "Oh, we learned that we had more than 600 kilometers to travel, and that we would not arrive at the place until the next day. Toward evening our wagon was unhitched and put on the spare tracks. The soldiers left, locking the wagon tightly and closing the outer shutters. From the sound of it, one of them was on duty outside all the time. We began to settle in for the night, and soon everyone in the wagon was asleep. All the last week I had been looking at Piskarov, and after my farewell conversation with Gorchakov, I looked at him very closely. I did not like him by some, probably prejudiced, feeling it seemed to me that even there, at home, he was a member of the party. People of this type, having nothing of their own to bring them to the front ranks, but having a constant thirst to play an important role, joined the party, sat down in soft armchairs behind wide desks with a telephone, in their office, with a secretary at the door, and relying on their position as party members, played this important role running a collective farm, a factory, or a trust, with little understanding of the matter, but piously adhering to the party line. The bosses were satisfied with them, and they were satisfied with their important position and access to closed distribution centers. I had a premonition that he and I probably wouldn't work together. I could not find out who he was, where he came from, where and when he was captured. Shurapov, or Tolka, as everyone began to call him, was just a boy, only 20 years old. He was a penultimate year student at the Institute of Foreign Languages in Odessa, but German was his native language. He was born, raised and brought up in his mother's family, the daughter of German colonists in the Odessa area. He was a cheeky, somehow jaded, very nervous, thin and restless as a flyboy. After the hunger he had experienced in the Chenstokoe camp for Red Army soldiers, he could not get enough to eat, and, having instantly swallowed his portion, begged others for at least one more bite. At night our wagon was again attached to the train, and I fell asleep to the measured rocking of the wagon and the clatter of the wheels. In the morning the soldiers brought coffee with German army hard as stone gallets and sat down again at the open doors of the teplushka. It was about 12 o'clock in the afternoon when we were unloaded from the wagon. The station building was inscribed in Gothic letters Greyswald. In columns of 2, guarded by all 6 soldiers and a field sergeant, we followed a path across the field to a large group of red brick buildings. The weather was overcast, foggy, drizzling with a light rain, and by the time we reached these buildings we were all soaked and cold. Through a large, imposing gate, with concrete German eagles and swastikas, we were led into a wide courtyard, where a red flag with a white circle and a black swastika, heavy from the rain, was sluggishly waving on a high mast. This was Stalag IC. The rain was getting heavier, and we stood in the middle of the courtyard. The soldiers and the Feldfebel had left, leaving only one standing dejectedly in the rain, wrapped in his raincoat. Piskarov, in spite of our requests, refused to ask a soldier to allow us to cross the courtyard and take shelter under the covered passage between the buildings. Then I took the initiative, approached the soldier, and using my poor stock of German words and a large number of gestures and facial expressions, explained our request to him. The soldier immediately agreed, and we hid from the rain under an awning. My actions over the heads of my superiors were obviously not to Piskarov's liking, but everyone else was pleased. Finally, about 25 minutes later, our convoy field felon appeared, accompanied by a non-commissioned officer, evidently from the camp management. There was an official handover of live goods from hand to hand, according to a name list. The Feldfebel said to us label wall, waved his hand and left, and the non-commissioner ordered us to follow him. By passages between the buildings, through several gates guarded by sentries, he led us into a room like a large garage with bunk beds of iron. Here we were met by a young, neatly dressed man in a Soviet naval commander's uniform who said to us, "Hello, gentlemen. My name is Vyacheslav Mikhailovich Granov. I work in the Stalag Chancellery, then in the Russian department. You will stay in this room for 2 or 3 days before you go to the work camp to which you are assigned. Now you will be fed, then you will go to the bathhouse and receive new uniforms and underwear. Lieutenant Andrei Kuzmik Novikov will stay with you. And I will come again after 5 in the evening, and then I will share with you what I know about your future work and the conditions in which you will live." They brought food, good soup, bread, boiled potatoes in sufficient quantity. We ate, and at once Novikov took us first to the bath, and then to reclothing. We were given new underwear. Almost all of us received English woolen military pants and blue-grey Dutch jackets, besides 2 pairs of grey paper thick socks and a pair of rough, sturdy, well-mended boots. In the warehouse where we received all this wealth, we could even be matched for size and height. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon we, clean, decently dressed and relatively well-fed, returned, led by Novikov, to our temporary quarters, and here a surprise awaited us. On the table stood 2 cardboard boxes with an inscription in Russian housewarming gift. It was the Russian group in the camp who had decided to mark our arrival. In the boxes were canned meat, cookies, dried fruit, milk and egg powder, cigarettes, chocolate. Melnikov and Piskarov began to divide all this into 32 parts, and Novikov at this time told us about where we had come. This Stalag IC is the centre for the whole of Pomerania, all work teams, in agriculture at the Boers, in industry and on the railroad, that are administratively subordinate to the Stalag. In the camp itself live privates from the French and Belgian army, those who do not want or for some reason cannot work. They are not forced. There are not many of us Russians here, only 32 people, just like you. There are 7 working in the chancery, 9 in the tailor's shop, 11 in the shoemaker's shop, and 5 in the kitchen. Granov is the foreman of our entire Russian team. There are nearly 5,000 Red Army soldiers in the work teams assigned to our Stalag. We have excellent relations with the French and Belgians, and therefore we do not need anything. I must say that in terms of food, I personally never lived like this before the war, at home. Your group is the first officer group sent to work in our Stalag. He said that almost everyone in their group had been captured in the Kiev encirclement, and they, the clerical officers, had been selected here on the basis of their knowledge of at least 2 languages, German and French or English. Granov was a sailor, fished out of the water by the Germans after a shipwreck in the Baltic Sea, and he knew German, French and fluent English. The French and Belgians living permanently in the camp were about 4,000, in addition to about another 1,000 or so in work crews, mainly of large Boers. In addition, there were 2 special camps run by the Stalag administration, one for the political staff of the Red Army and Navy, the other a punitive camp for French and Belgians who were guilty, under the Geneva Convention. At the camp there was a permanent representation of the International Red Cross, but any communication between this representation and the Russian group was strictly forbidden. Our temporary camp was a long building with 8 large rooms, originally, apparently garages for heavy vehicles or perhaps tanks. 5 of these rooms were locked, one was occupied by clericals, another by the rest of the Russian group, and the third was given to us. On the other side of the narrow, long courtyard was exactly the same building, but without doors, and on the sides were high barbed wire fences with wickets. One was locked, and the other, through which we passed, was guarded by a sentry. At 5:30, all the members of the small Russian colony of the Stalag came home from work, and immediately dinner arrived on 2 carts. After the housewarming gift, no one actually wanted to eat, but a prisoner never refuses food, and we filled our stomachs to capacity. Granov appeared after dinner, came to our room, asked for general attention, and began to tell us what he knew. Na, with a mysterious O, is a large complex of production-type military laboratories and testing stations located on the island of Uzdom, at the mouth of the Pina River, in 3 towns: Pinamonde, Zinowitz and Kozero. Our camp is established in the town of Wolgast, on the mainland, opposite Uzdom. So far there are only 10 Red Army prisoners there, i.e. the housekeeping team. The camp is waiting for us. The camp is equipped with a drafting room in which we will work. The management of the camp is twofold. On the administrative line, it is subordinate to the Stalag, i.e. to the Wehrmacht, and the commandant there is Field Febel Radatz. Granov has never seen him, but has heard that he is a military marriage. For some reason he was expelled to the rear, in spite of his young age. On the production line, the camp is under the jurisdiction of the ANR, whose representative and chief on the spot is the engineer Karl Michael, the same one who made the selection for the work at Hammelburg. The living conditions in the camp are supposed to be quite tolerable. The food is standard Wehrmacht food, according to the schedule for work teams. The arrangement and organization of this camp is a consequence of one of the first German attempts to use the qualified part of the Soviet prisoners for their specialty, rationally and efficiently. The camp where we will be placed is only the beginning of the experiment. Already now the construction of another, much larger camp, designed for 300 to 400 specialists working in several workshops, has begun there in Wolgast. Our team, sent from Hammelburg, should become the basis, the backbone of the future, much larger. Granov took our list out of his tunic pocket and said that according to this list, compiled by Michael and approved by the Stalag administration, Major Pyotr Piskarov was appointed the team foreman and Russian commandant. Of the camp, Anatoly Sharupov was appointed the official interpreter and the foreman in the drawing room. Granov called my name. For me it was completely unexpected. I did not understand why I was honored. I could only suppose that either I had made a good impression on Michael during the conversation in Hammelburg, or, what was more likely, that I had been recommended by Colonel Gorchakov, who had treated me exceptionally well from the first day of our acquaintance in Podnezy. In any case, both Granov himself and my teammates congratulated me on my appointment as chief engineer of the prisoner of war, NAR Design Bureau. We stayed in Stalag for 4 days. Everyone rested, ate, calmed down. The food was quite decent and sufficient. The Russian group received rations on a par with other prisoners from the common kitchen. Besides, we were always brought different delicacies from the Red Cross parcels received by the French and Belgians and specially given by them for us. The small group of Soviet prisoners who had been taken to Stalag lived here as if they were living under Christ's thumb. Tailors and shoemakers served mainly the prisoners in the camp itself and always received gratitude from their customers who brought them clothes and shoes for repair. The clerks, who worked in the file room of Russian prisoners assigned to the camp and spoke good French, had friendly relations with their colleagues in the administration, and not only constantly received from them the same delicacies from the Krasnokreski parcels, but also, with the permission of the Stalag administration, took part in the life of the foreign part of the camp. They took part in chess competitions, sports games. 2 of them were regular members of the camp orchestra. In both living quarters of this group there were individual beds with sheets and blankets, tables and chairs, individual lockers. The rooms were insulated and had stoves. The prisoners had a good Russian library, where along with old Russian classics and books by Soviet authors there was a lot of emigrant literature. All of them were apparently content with their fate, and all clearly avoided talking about political topics, discussing world and military events, and talking about the future. I asked him 2 questions: whether he knew more about Wolgast and the ANR than he had told us, and how he morally viewed our situation, the situation of Soviet or Russian engineers forced to work in the German war industry. To the first question he answered simply no. I have told you everything I know, I have no additional information. Then, as if with curiosity, looked at me and said, your second question is very naive. Or is it a provocation? And after a moment's silence, added, let's go to my corner and talk. This corner was behind large cabinets and a tarpaulin curtain in the room where the clerks lived: a bed, a table, several chairs, a closet, a shelf with books, a gramophone. Very clean, neat, and even comfortable. We sat down. Looking around, I said, it seems to me that now I have seen the whole wide range of living conditions of a Soviet prisoner in German camps, from the barracks in Zamosk, where 6 dozen starving wretches lay on the floor, to this corner with a good bed, books, and a gramophone. And of course, the owner of this corner does not feel hunger. I understand your bitter feeling. So before answering your question about morality, I want to make some introduction, he replied, and told me the following. He was a hereditary sailor born and brought up in Kronstadt. His father, who died in the Kronstadt uprising, was one of those who remained loyal to the communist government and did not join the rebels. His mother had died even earlier, and he, a round orphan and the son of a dead hero, was admitted to the naval school on full state dependence. He was a Komsomol member and, having graduated with honours, was appointed commander in the Baltic Fleet. By the beginning of the war, Granov was already a commander of a destroyer and, of course, a member of the party. As a capable and knowledgeable foreign language commander, he was prepared for a military diplomatic career, which included visits to foreign ports, participation in various missions, etc. But in the first days of the war, his destroyer was sunk, Granov and 3 sailors, on a half-broken dinghy, for 3 days dangled in the open sea, until they were not discovered and fished out of the water by the Germans. Thus Granov found himself a prisoner of war. I had only 2 possibilities when the German sailor extended his hand to me, helping me to get from the dinghy to the boat to spit in his face and shout that the Soviet commander in captivity does not surrender and die a hero, or to accept the helping hand and go to the category of traitors to the motherland. I chose the second. And I don't regret it. Granov took out of the desk drawer a metal plaque with his name and identification number. That's all I have left of the Soviet motherland. I have lost everything, but I have regained the respect for myself, lost more than 15 years ago, when after the school I entered the Navy as a commander. 24 hours a day I lied as everyone around me lied. Now I've become myself and stopped lying to others and myself. He spent almost 3 months in the camp in Königsberg, where the conditions of the prisoners were similar to Zamosk, but when his rank and knowledge of languages became clear, he was brought to Greifswald and offered to work in the file room of the Russian department in the position of the head of the group. I was lucky. I was only 3 months in the position you have been in for over a year. I ventured to ask him a direct question: so are you now fully in the camp of the enemy? Oh no, he answered energetically. There is no way back to Peter, but modern Germany does not appeal to me either. Even in case of victory, Germany will have to find a way out of the deadlock into which Hitler has led her. In the 20th century, you can't run a society by medieval methods, and I'm not going to go with such a Germany. With regard to the question of morality, his thought was as follows: every job of a prisoner of war in Germany helps her in the war with the Soviet Union and the Allies. A loader in the port or on the railroad, a fitter in a factory, a tractor driver at a bower, a carpenter in construction, or a draftsman in a design office are equal in this respect. There are only 2 possibilities: to agree or to refuse. To agree means to live somehow, and to be a witness or participant in the events at the end of the war. To refuse means to die in one of the special purpose camps. He concluded, that's up to you. But in my opinion, the morality of working for Stalin, who mocks the Russian people, is also very problematic, and I now think that maybe somehow we can overcome the greater evil there, at home, perhaps a lesser evil for all of us here in Germany. As I parted from Granov, I thought that the thoughts of Ladishevsky, Gorchakov, and to a certain extent my own, had much in common with the statements of this ex-communist sailor. The next day, in the afternoon, our whole crew was led out to the yard where we had arrived. We had to pass the block where the French lived, and they gave us a whole ovation. There was a truck waiting for us, but before we were loaded, we were lined up in 2 rows, and a thin, immaculately dressed military man in a field sergeant's uniform appeared in front of the line and said something like a welcoming word. This was Radatz, the commandant of the camp at Wolgast. His speech was translated by Shurupov. Then an elderly lieutenant of small stature came up to us. He had a very professorial appearance, a beard, gold-rimmed glasses, a slightly wrinkled, ill-fitting uniform, a soft, even shy smile, nothing military. He addressed us in Russian, but with a strong German accent and funny snaggle-toothed expressions. "You gentlemen are travelling for drafting work, and please behave with discipline." He called himself Sonderführer Zeichelmann and said he was in charge of the Russian department in the Stalag. "I am your great friend, and I want you to live well. If you work well, your superiors will treat you well too. And I want everyone to be well." After these parting words, we were ordered to get into the truck. Fieldfebel Radatz got into the cab. 4 soldiers with carbines sat down at the back of the truck, and we set off. In about 40 minutes, we drove along a good asphalt road, on both sides of which were fields and vegetable gardens, into a cosy German town with a town hall, churches, stores and restaurants, with small quiet streets lined with trees and bushes. After driving through the town, our truck entered a dead end near a small factory and stood at a gate in a barbed wire fence. It turned out had been awaiting our arrival for over a month. They greeted us affably and began to tell us how they got here, what conditions were like, and of course, as always among the prisoners, the main topic was food. The so-called standard ration of a Soviet prisoner in a work team was very insufficient, or simply hungry. 1/2 pound of bread for a day, a litre of liquid soup with potatoes and German lard, as cubes of rutabaga or kohlrabi were called, and finely chopped pieces of meat, i.e., chopped up unknown parts of unknown animals, which the camp received at the local slaughterhouse. In addition, 20 grams of cheese or sausage, 2 tablespoons of borage jelly, and on Sundays a few hard army galettes. Every morning and every evening one could get a Zatz coffee, as much as one wanted, and 2 or 3 boiled potatoes. Our experts immediately calculated 1,100 calories. The next day, after rising at 6 o'clock in the morning, we were all lined up in 2 rows in the courtyard, and all our superiors showed up. Fieldfebel Radatz, the commandant, and junior non-commissioned officer Frank, his assistant, i.e., representatives of the Wehrmacht, and the representatives of the NAR company were our old acquaintance engineer Michael and a non-commissioned officer in Luftwaffe uniform named Valura. First Radatz, then Michael said the same thing: "If we behave well, then we will be treated well, by the command, and if not, then blame yourselves." After this introduction and a very meagre breakfast, to which we added something from the supplies made at Greifswald, we were ushered into the drafting room, the place of our work. The team was to consist of 60 men, and for this number of draftsmen the hall was fitted up. Each had a table with a drawing board, on which was mounted a rail on blocks, and a lamp on an articulated pedestal, and by the table a metal chair on a screw column. The workstations were arranged in 3 rows, 20 in each. Michel demanded attention and said roughly as follows: "This room is your workplace. You must first regain your professional abilities, remember how drawings are competently made, and make them in exact accordance with the norms and standards of German industry." He picked up 2 volumes of Den Deutsche Industrie Norm and showed them to us. Accompanying him, as always, Valura added unexpectedly to us: "The Bible is for you. Do you understand? Pan God punished me." It turned out that Valura was Czech. Turning to me, Michel said, "You are appointed foreman of the drawing workshop. I will show you your workplace and give you the appropriate instructions." There was a separate room at the end of the hall with a wide window into the hall. There was a table by the window and a row of cabinets against the walls. The conversation with Michael I remembered well, as it determined our future relations. When I asked him why I was appointed senior, he replied sharply, "I don't know. It was a recommendation from Hammelburg, probably because you are senior in rank. I personally do not care which Ivan will be senior here." Michael's instructions were uncomplicated and concerned mainly accounting for the drawings being made, checking their compliance with the standards, issuing and accounting for drawing aids and paper. In one of the cabinets were stacked small drawers in which were neatly arranged a drawing board, a set of triangles, molds, a logarithmic ruler, a scale bar, and other small accessories. These individual boxes were to be given to everyone in the morning, and at the end of the day to receive them back and check if everything was intact. The whole set of fixtures, drawing boards, lamps, and even chairs, everything was brand new. For the first few days, everyone enjoyed restoring their professional abilities, thumbing through books of norms and standards, actually well known to all of us, since our Soviet ghosts were almost an exact copy of the German DINs. Then it became tiresome. A big box of Russian books, almost exclusively fiction, was brought from Stalag, and everyone was reading instead of drawing. No one bothered us. Michael and Valyura appeared rarely and were not at all interested in what we were doing. But we were reading away and dreamed of being full again. Feldfebel Radats defiantly did not go into the drawing. The relationship between the representatives of the ANR and the Wehrmacht, represented by Michael and Radats, was clearly unfriendly and strained, if not outright hostile. This was probably not only a local, personal phenomenon, but came from above. Radats and Michael, not embarrassed by the presence of the prisoners, often quarrelled among themselves, and it was clear from the tone and content of these often very loud arguments that the bickering was between departments. Michael and Valyura, for their part, never went into the other rooms of the camp, from gate to drawing room and from drawing room to gate, also very demonstratively. Intolerably shiny black lacquered visor, and demanded that under all official circumstances Piskarev, the Russian commandant of the camp, wear it. Such official circumstances were usually the arrival of guests. These visits during the first months of our life in Wolgast were quite frequent. When the military came, Radats would fall into a hysterical state, hitch up his sword, run around the camp like a meteor, and at every question of the visiting chief would shout, with his pale blue Aryan eyes bulging, jowl, and when saying goodbye he would click his heels, making a crimson ring with his spurs, for some reason in a low octave, and growl Heil Hitler. If the visitors were civilian, he behaved much more calmly, and even somewhat carelessly, as if with condescension gave explanations to the visitors, and when saying goodbye only raised his hand in fascist greeting, but in silence. The draftsmen were arriving, almost all the places in the barracks were already occupied. The Red Army men were arriving. Their barracks was also almost full. They were all working on the construction of a new camp on the other side of Wolgast. They left immediately after breakfast and returned for dinner. They got their lunch at work. We were fed very badly. Peter Ivanovich Loskutkov, the cook and head of the kitchen, tried his best to feed us all somehow with the meagre amount of food that Unter Frank gave him, by begging and bargaining, and sometimes, if the opportunity presented itself, by cheating. Frank, he put into the boiler everything he could. Pyotr Ivanovich was an exceptionally nice, modest and sympathetic man, scrupulously fair. The role of head of the catering shop, as he himself called his position in the camp, he fulfilled with all seriousness. He was an old believer from Tsarevo-Koksheysk, where he had a wife and 9 children, and he loved to talk about his family. Peter Ivanovich in the army was also a company cook, so with his kitchen on wheels he was captured near Vazma. Unter Frank, a gorilla-like, huge, gloomy brute, was by nature a sadist and liked to abuse the prisoners, often abusing them in the Red Army barracks, despite the fact that Radats forbade abusing, reserving this privilege only for himself. True, he himself rarely engaged in such matters. Franke treated Peter Ivanovich with respect. One incident had evidently made a lasting impression on him. Soon after the arrival of our group, Peter Ivanovich counted Franke for several pounds of peas, and before he realized the count, Peter Ivanovich hurriedly put everything into the boiler. Franke became furious and, seizing a long wooden stirrer, struck Peter Ivanovich, but when he wanted to repeat the blow, Peter Ivanovich armed himself with a large kitchen knife and stood in front of Franke with such a determined look that he put down the stirrer, swore and left. When Pyotr Ivanovich told me about this, I asked him if he could really put the knife to work. He grinned and replied, "I could have. I'm a poor man. One stab it is clear, everyone can do it in the heat of the moment, but then it's enough. Franke's figured it out, and now we have a sort of agreement with him, a norm, and if I cheat him, it's mine. Don't yawn, then. Piskarov had somehow completely lost his nerve and even handed over seniority in the room to someone else. At first he tried to conduct explanatory work. But his speeches, with standard curses against the Soviet Union and the same standard praise of the Third Reich, were usually so helpless and primitive that no one wanted to listen to him. He was too simple for intelligent listeners, unbound in their judgments and unafraid to express them. If they listened to him, it was only to laugh at him and stump him. He turned into a confused and disoriented man, while clearly suffering from his strange and offensive position, on the right flank, wearing a stupid bright yellow cap put on him by a German neurasthenic Feldfebel. A real, complete freedom of speech had been established in our camp. The first manifestation of this human social privilege began immediately after captivity, back in the field camps, but there it soon turned into a lopsided freedom. The sharp outbreak of anti-communist and Judeophobic statements, and the opportunity to express one's thoughts on the subject, was as if a compensation for years of concealing and silencing one's feelings. The topics of discussion and conversation were very limited. Then, under the influence of the circumstances and conditions of camp existence, the fear of being caught for sympathizing with Soviet philosophy, or, even worse, with the Jews, brought everyone back to the need to keep their mouths shut, and hunger generally suspended all mental activity. In Lisogary and in Hammelburg freedom of speech began to flourish again, but here in Wolgast, with the comparatively quiet and idle life and the tolerable hunger, conversations and arguments about social organization, political systems and philosophy, about religion, about the ongoing war, about our present and probable future, became the main daily occupation of many. In our group, the youngest was 27 and the oldest 54. Everyone had a Soviet education, but all of a sudden we had among us representatives of the most diverse points of view and the most diverse beliefs, from Marxists to equally convinced monarchists, from very religious people to complete 100% atheists. For me, such a wide range of mindsets among the seemingly homogeneous mass of sub-Soviet engineers was convincing proof that all the 25 years of communist efforts to create a Soviet man had failed utterly. That is why Piskarov, who in all probability was accustomed there, at home, to an equally minded mass of listeners, began to avoid speaking on abstract subjects altogether. Since the team of draftsmen was the basis of the whole camp, and I was the foreman of this team, I gradually turned into the chief representative of the prisoners before the German administration. This imposed on me some unofficial but clearly tangible duty and responsibility, a representative, a person who sought, to the extent possible, to improve the conditions of our camp life. The main thing was our constantly hungry condition. I tried to raise this issue with the Germans. I appealed to Michel, but he stated that food matters did not concern him, and that it was a matter for the Wehrmacht and not for Peenemünde. In a week or two, a special commission will come here. Among the members of the commission will be a man by the name of Fetzer. If you succeed, talk to him. A lot depends on him, he told me. At the very beginning, when our group arrived from Hammelburg, Major Afanasyev, a great lover of singing and possessor of a good, sonorous baritone, organized a small choir of 7 people. Now, there were about 20 choristers in this choir. They sang very well, and often in the evenings, after work, arranged real concerts for us. Radats also came to these concerts. He too turned out to be a lover of singing. His favorite songs were Stenka Razin, My Moscow, My Country. He would sit on a chair and try to sing along, and if he was satisfied, he would say Karosh, Ocean Karosh and Karosh, and give an order to Peter Ivanovich to get extra from Frunk in the warehouse. So the concerts became a responsible business, and we treated all the choristers with great respect. Our camp authorities attached great importance to the arrival of the commission. Everywhere was cleaned. Michel ordered that on each drawing table was attached a special plate with the name and Michel ordered that each drafting table should have a special plate with the name and title of the draftsman, that each table should have an unfinished drawing simulating everyday work, and that on the day of the commission's arrival everyone should have clean hands and shined shoes. Radats decided to treat the important visitors to a concert and insisted that the choir learn a German hymn, but he had to abandon this idea, because Afanasyev and I told him that if he wanted the choir to sing a German hymn, the choir should sing the Internationale beforehand. The weight of the places in the 3 rooms of our engineering barracks were taken. On the last 2, in my room, arrived Lieutenant Colonel Igor Lyashenko and Navy Lieutenant Alexander Rodionov, mechanical engineers from Leningrad. Lyashenko, who had been captured in the winter of 1941, hid his rank and worked long hours as a private for a peasant in Latvia. Rodionov, who was captured during the first days of the war in Riga, was first released from captivity on the bail of his cousin, a half-German, but then, mistaken for some commissar, was arrested and spent a year in a special regime camp on the island of Rügen, after which he was transferred to our camp because the same cousin managed to prove the mistake that led to his arrest. Both turned out to be very nice and intelligent people, and I became fast friends with them. The constant malnutrition was beginning to take a heavy toll on the physical and mental condition of the prisoners again. Everyone was weak, tired, frowning and nervous. We calculated that an extra 7 to 8 potatoes a day per person would be enough to bring the caloric content of the ration to 1,800 calories, the minimum required for an adult not engaged in physical labor. I again turned to Michael, and he again said that these matters were not within his purview, and therefore he was not interested. I mentioned the extra potatoes to Radats, but the latter looked at me with surprise and called me crazy. The matter seemed to be quite hopeless. At last the day came for which the camp was being prepared. 15 military and civilian men, headed by a general, arrived in 5 cars. After the usual procedure of building up, with Piskarev in his yellow cap on the right flank, and inspecting the premises, we were all ordered to sit by rooms, while a committee was sitting in the drawing room, apparently deciding important questions, as there was a sentry in front of the doors. I was nervous. What if I never got to talk to this Fetzer? I had a ready idea how to get that miserable 10 potatoes per person for the camp. I knew that the local Boers suffered from a lack of labour, especially during harvest time. My idea was to organise small brigades and send them out to do field work, and receive payment for our work from the Boers in kind, and thus create additional food for the prisoners. I did not talk about it with Radats or Michael, knowing that they themselves would not dare to do such a thing, but if someone from above, like this Fetzer, on whom much depends, approves such an idea, we will stop being hungry. The superiors began to come out of the drawing room and get into the cars. We were ordered to go to the hall and put everything in order after the meeting, to clean up cigar butts, cigar ashes, papers on the floor, and puddles of spilled water and beer. The commissioners left, and I never saw Fetzer. But we were lucky. When, after cleaning the room, we took our places at the boards again and went back to doing nothing, Michael came to the drawing room, and with him came a short, stout, bald man in uniform and wearing glasses with very thick glasses. They stood at the door. Michael went back to the German barracks, and the newcomer said loudly in pure Russian, "Hello, mister. Engineers, or do you prefer that I call you comrade engineers? Or say, mister, comrade engineers? It makes no difference to me personally. My name is Rudolf Rudolfovich Fescher. I am what is called here a Sonderführer, i.e., a special leader." He said that from that day on he would visit our team often, and when we moved to the new permanent camp, he would live at the camp for some time. Until the work there is not settled, Fescher also said that our work would begin after the move, and that we would stop beating a cormorant then. He asked me to show him technical support, supplies and everything else you have in your closets. After looking around, he sat down at the table in my room and unceremoniously examined me. I felt uncomfortable and awkward under the gaze of Fetzer's watery light eyes, ugly magnified by the thick glasses. He took out a pack of cigarettes, lit a cigarette, and, giving me a treat, asked, "Well, what do you say, mister?" "Chief engineer." "We are hungry." "That's all I can say. Herr Sonderführer," I replied. Fetzer looked at me in surprise. "You are receiving the standard military rations you are entitled to, and I can't help you in this case." Further conversation became rather acrimonious, to the point that Fetzer got up and closed the window to the drafting room when I said that, hungry as we were. We could hardly do any of the engineering work for which we had been brought here. "You will do the work you are ordered to do, and any shirking of work and attempts to sabotage it will be severely prosecuted. Understood, said Fetzer very angrily, standing up. I replied that all engineering work involves brain work, and if a hungry slave can be made to work physically to the point of exhaustion by blows of the whip, it is hardly possible to make engineering thought work by such methods. I added that 2 extra sacks of potatoes a day might solve the problem. What nonsense are you talking? Where am I going? To get you those potatoes. When I mentioned the idea of working for the Boers, he said nothing and left, slamming the door. The loud conversation and Fetzer's angry look rattled the whole crew. Many feared that I had overdone it, but that I would certainly not be retained as foreman of the drawing, and that because of all this nutrition will deteriorate even more. Michael and Radatz said the same thing. The next day Michael said, Mr. Fetzer was very dissatisfied after talking to you. He said that you are too persistent and talk a lot. You talk a lot, and Radatz at the morning inspection looked at me skeptically and remarked, Sie sind Kopf, ein großer Dummkopf. But I won. Fetzer arrived and reported that in Peenemünde my idea was found worthy of attention, and that in the near future Radatz would conclude a contract with the local Boers. A few days later the first 15-man brigade went to work, and the hunger was over. The soup became thick, with peas and potatoes. In the morning and evening we received hot boiled potatoes, and in the afternoon we baked the same potatoes and sugar beets in a stove in the drafting room. I became a very respected person in the camp. Fetzer began to come to the camp often and stayed long hours in the drawing room, talking to the prisoners. When they got used to him, he began to be called simply by his first name and middle name, instead of the official Herr Sonderführer, and conversations became more frank, sometimes turning into ideological disputes. Once he was asked how he knew Russian so well, and he willingly told me about himself. He was the son of a German consul in the Urals, graduated from gymnasium in Perm and studied for 2 years at Kazan University. When the war broke out in 1914, his father and his entire family were exiled from Russia. Rudolf Rudolfovich himself took part in the war as an interpreter and intelligence officer, thanks to his absolute knowledge of the Russian language, then participated in the formation of the Syshevik Corps, and together with this corps ended up in Kiev under the government of Hetman Skoropadsky. He was, of course, a Nazi and, in all probability, held a high position in the ANR system, since all the work camps of Soviet prisoners and Ostarbeiters were under his supervision. There is no doubt that in his work he was in one way or another connected with the Gestapo, just as any communist in responsible work in the USSR was connected with the NKVD. But Fetzer was not a bad guy, or perhaps he wanted to appear that way for his own reasons. With him you could joke, argue and talk freely on the most acute topical issues. He was well-read, knew Russian literature both pre- and post-revolutionary, knew Russian history, and in these fields his knowledge was much broader and deeper than that of most of our draftsmen. He was well informed about life in the Soviet Union, and was well versed in all questions of relations between the government and the people at all levels of the Soviet social system. It was interesting to talk to him, as he was well aware of such things that were carefully concealed by the authorities in the USSR from the people, but were well known in Europe. He was a convinced National Socialist and fiercely defended his ideology in arguments. In his way of thinking, Fetzer was a strange mixture of a Kazan liberal student from the beginning of the century and a German national fascist from the 40s. As we became well-fed, had no work, and received books from the Stalag library, and Shurupov brought newspapers and magazines from the German barracks, our main occupation was to talk on a variety of subjects. We were quite familiar with the general military situation. Moscow and Leningrad remained in the hands of the Red Army, although the Germans had reached the Volga and Stalingrad was under threat of capture. In all newspapers and magazines there were pictures of the Nazi flag hoisting on the top of Mount Elbrus. The Germans sought to capture Voronezh, occupied the North Caucasus, but all these victories required great effort and sacrifice. We learned to read between the lines in German official reports and picked up decent traces of pessimism among the official fanfare. The Red Army not only resisted but also retaliated heavily. Soviet aircraft bombed Vienna, Budapest, and other deep rear areas. Rommel's military fortunes in North Africa were also beginning to change. Only Japan was inflicting crushing defeats on America, capturing most of China and a huge area of the Malay archipelago, from Indochina to Australia. Fetzer assured us that Japan would soon declare war on the Soviet Union, and then the war would be over certainly with an Axis victory in a matter of months. We were supposed to move into the new camp now after Christmas, but in the last week of November a very serious incident occurred. There was a new prisoner in the Red Army barracks, Ivan Cherpovets, a young fellow, an aviation sergeant, a specialist electrician, or electronics technician, as he called himself. A handsome, agile fellow, talkative and sociable, he befriended Shurupov from the very first days, and they spent all their free time together. Shurupov, who had no technical education, did not work in the drawing room, and he was not needed as an interpreter either, except when visitors came. So Michael used him as his personal servant. Shurupov cleaned his room, often cooked his meals. Cherpovets was working on the construction of a new camp. That day Shurupov came to the drawing room to change books in the library. He sat by the window and read something. The day was damp, cold. It was raining half with wet snow. A car arrived at the camp gate, and 12 soldiers jumped out of it, quickly entered the camp, and stood at the doors of all the rooms. Then Radats appeared and, walking with quick steps across the courtyard, entered the drafting room. He stood in the doorway and shouted Shurupov, "Komm her, Mensch." And when the pale Shurupov approached him, Radats whipped him several times in the face with his stack and, seizing him by the scruff of the neck, pushed him out into the courtyard. We all rushed to the windows and saw how 2 soldiers led Shurupov to the room where he lived, beating him with the butts of their carbines on the way. I, with Piskarov and Afanasiev, wanted to go out of the drawing room to find out what had happened, but the soldiers roughly pushed us back into the room and slammed the doors. A few minutes later another car arrived, and from it they literally dragged out a bloody, beaten, half-naked Cherpovets and drove him to the Red Army barracks with kicks and blows. We stood at the windows and wondered what had happened. Finally, almost simultaneously, Shurupov and Cherpovets were taken out into the yard. Shurupov looked terrible, covered in blood, in a torn shirt he could hardly move, limping and holding his stomach with both hands. Both of them were taken to a German barracks. We were not allowed into the yard. Lunch was delayed until 3:30, and on receiving it we were again locked in the drawing room. There were soldiers at the door again. When the men on duty were receiving lunch, Peter Ivanovich said that it seemed that Shurupov and Cherpovets were preparing an escape. The arrested men were taken out of the German barracks and tied to a lamppost standing in the gap between 2 wire fences. Both were wearing only underpants. They were tied with their backs to each other. Even from the decent distance separating the drawing from the fence, the marks of brutal beatings on their bodies, hanging lifelessly from the ropes holding them upright, were clearly visible. We opened the window and began to demand that Radats or Michael come and stop the torture of our 2 comrades. Franke appeared with a pistol in his hand, brought 5 soldiers into the hall, closed the window, drove everyone to the opposite wall, and put the soldiers at the windows and ordered them to shoot at any of us who approached the doors or windows or made noise and disobedience. It began to get dark. We could hear that the Red Army soldiers from the building had returned, but they too were immediately driven into the rooms. The lights were turned on in the camp. All 5 soldiers continued to stand, pointing their rifles at us, frowning at our every movement. We heard that an automobile had pulled up again, and Germans were walking in the yard, talking and cursing loudly. It was quite dark when Funke appeared, and we were all taken to our rooms. The doors were locked, and a sentry was posted at each room. We did not receive dinner, nor did we receive briquettes for heating. The lights in the barracks were turned off early, and we sat in the cold and dark all night. In the morning they let out only the men on duty to get breakfast. The Red Army men did not go to work either. From the same Pyotr Ivanovich we learned that Shurupov and Cherpovets had been taken away last night, before we were taken to the barracks. Immediately after breakfast, one by one from each room, people were taken out into the yard, and the soldiers thoroughly searched the room, taking all things that could in one way or another be used as weapons or tools, knives, razors, scissors, etc. After the search of the room was over, All the prisoners were also carefully searched, taking away, again, similar personal effects, and, with Radatz's apparent connivance, the soldiers did not hesitate in hand-wringing on the slightest occasion. When I withdrew my hands from the soldiers' hands and wanted to empty my pockets myself, I received a heavy blow on my arm. The search continued almost all day long, and we were not even allowed to go to the restroom and had to use the night parashas. Fuel was again not issued, and rations were reduced to the Dobauer times. The whole of the next day continued in the same way. Only in the evening they gave out, as usual, 2 buckets of briquettes for heating. Radatz walked around the camp angrily, here and there putting his stack into action. Menhel and Fetzer did not show up. Only on the 3rd day normal life was restored. The Red Army men went to work, and we went to the drawing room. We were all in a nervous, tense state, full of indignation against the German superiors who had organized the brutal beating and torture of Shurupov and Cherpovets for attempting to escape. Shortly before dinner, Fetzer came in. He said hello and mockingly asked, "What have you good gentlemen done here?" "What do you say, Mr. Chief Engineer?" he addressed me. I replied that we had not done anything, but that the camp administration had done a lot of completely unjustified, cruel outrages. The administration brutally beat and brutalized 2 prisoners of war for a failed escape attempt. It is known that it is the right of every POW to try to escape. That's what the guards and barbed wire fences are for. Otherwise there is no point in all this. We have the right to escape. And you have the right to catch us and put us back behind the wire, but you have no right to beat and abuse us. Fetzer flared up like gunpowder. Shut up. First of all, Soviet soldiers have no rights in our camps. Your government itself decided not to recognize these rights for you. It simply abandoned you, calling you criminals and traitors. Secondly, a POW with such a status has the right to escape. But how? In his national uniform, and without using anything, not even a nail or rope, belonging to the country that took him prisoner. Otherwise it's considered kidnapping of military property. These 2 knuckleheads stole a soldier's knife, military-style barbed wire cutters, 5 packets of military marching rations, a first aid sanitary packet, and a pistol. Shurupov stole it from Mikul's suitcase. This pair of idiots had been under surveillance for days, outside and inside the camp. Shurupov stole here and Cherpovets at the construction site. They were both shot. And finally, thirdly, the escape of a Soviet soldier from internment camps usually ends in his death. And in the conditions of the ANR, this is 100% true. I advise you all to remember this firmly, and Fetzer walked away irritated. Fetzer's speech made a stunning impression on us, not by the fact that he once again confirmed our powerless slave position, without a country and outside the laws, and not by the fact that the Germans could torture and shoot us without taking any responsibility for it. We already understood this well. The main thing in his words was that they were already being watched from outside and inside the camp inside. That meant that there were people among us watching and snitching. Thus, with one word, accidentally or deliberately dropped, Sonderführer Fetzer destroyed what was the most important thing for us and what we all valued: the sense of comradeship, the sense of trust. With a wide variety of political beliefs and mindsets, we could freely express our thoughts without fear of denunciation and surveillance. The atmosphere in the camp was poisoned. The black shadows of the Soviet Union and Zamosk came out of the past again. People somehow withdrew, faded, and became silent. For no good reason, but for some reason many people suspected Piskarov. And before the incident with Shurupov and Cherpovets, Piskarov was disliked in the camp, and now he was simply boycotted. When our work crews resumed their trips to the Boers and the food supply improved again, Piskarov often went to Radatz's office after working in the drafting room to make lists of people assigned to work. This had been seen as a necessity before, now as the suspicious activity of a probable informer. 2 weeks later, suddenly in the afternoon, some unfamiliar non-commissioned officer arrived. Piskarov was summoned from the drawing room. He took his belongings and left the camp without saying goodbye to anyone. Now everyone was absolutely sure that the suspicions were correct and that Piskarov was the one who was watching inside. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief, and the tension between the prisoners in the drafting room was visibly diffused. We welcomed the new year of 1943. Radatz ordered the issue of extra, In the evening we received a very decent coffee, almost sweet, with milk powder and half a dozen cookies each. The lights in the barracks were put out only at 12:30 at night. And on January 4th, Fetzer brought a small Christmas tree. We made toys in a drawing and lit candles on it on Christmas Eve. We didn't work on the first day of Christmas. Immediately after Christmas, we packed the property, drawings in cardboard boxes for 2 days, and on the 10th we moved to the new camp,